Before we begin talking about the entry of the United States in the First World War, we should consider two really big questions surrounding the conflict. First, what caused the conflict? And second, was any one country more to blame? These are really important questions. And the answer to these questions actually exposes some really important, long-term lessons of history. What caused the conflict? Before I put these identification terms, these places, these events up, the first thing I would say is what caused the conflict is quite straightforward, and it is nationalism and imperialism. Nationalism and empire. Really, those are the root causes of the First World War, at least in its pre-war development, shall we say. Its long-term development. So, within those contexts, first of all, between major European powers, you had some old sort of territorial disputes. And I will show you a map to point some of these out in a second. Between France and Germany, the long-term dispute of Alsace and Lorraine. Alsace and Lorraine are two territories. Today, they're territories of France. And they're located right on the border of France and Germany. It's a historical sort of borderland between France and Germany in Europe. And this territory, which is associated today with a lot of old castles, small mountains, the Vosges Mountains, wine vineyards. But it's an area that was really on the border of the region of France and Germany. And as a result of this, it was oftentimes an area of dispute. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 71, Germany seized these territories. After the First World War, France will seize those territories back. And of course, during the Second World War, during the period of time when the Nazis dominated Europe before their defeat, of course, they controlled all of this as well as France. So there are old disputes and animosities, particularly long-term animosities between Germany and France. And Germany, it really becomes a country, by the way, late in the 19th century. Germany becomes a country under Otto von Bismarck in the 19th century in 1871, following the Franco-Prussian War. France was greatly concerned, as were the British, over a large German state in Central Europe. They were afraid it could offset the balance of power. And so you had old territorial disputes. You had empires competing with one another. The British and the Germans, for example, were engaged in a very significant arms race, building up bigger and bigger navies. They were competing as well for colonial territories, as Germany very much sought to catch up with the British, seizing colonies, and likewise competing with them as a global naval power. So there are military arms races, and that's a really important lesson, because when you have arms races, meaning that when you have competing powers that are increasingly building up the weapons of war, there is an increasing tendency to potentially use those weapons. They cost a lot of money, they're supposed to be built for a purpose, and they encourage countries to feel perhaps more confident in their abilities in war. And so arms races are very dangerous because they tend to encourage the development of war. So you had territorial disputes, border of France and Germany. You had an arms race between British and Germany. You also had two really huge factors, and these are really at the core of why the First World War happens. The first is nationalism, right? The desire of groups that identify as a part of a very specific nation to have independence and to have sovereignty and a right to govern themselves, coupled with empire. An empire is a large geopolitical entity that controls a myriad of different potential national identities, a larger region of different people that are controlled under one governing structure. And typically empires are associated with a form of manipulation and repression of the sort of groups on the margins of the empire, shall we say. So nationalism in empire, and particularly nationalism within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I'll show you a map in just a second. Connected to these issues, the issue of German power seeking, an arms race, and colonial competition with the British, with long-term territorial disputes and animosities, as well as the threat of nationalism to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This creates a Europe that is really divided into a series of different alliances. Germany was aligned with Austria. France was aligned with Russia. And Russia was aligned with Serbian nationalists. And these are the nationalists who are seeking to create an independent state out of Austria-Hungary. Here you see a map depicting these alliances and Europe in 1914. So a treaty alliance is such where if you're in an alliance with one country or the other, then an attack on that country is considered an attack on the entire alliance. So an attack or a war with Austria-Hungary is also a war with Germany. France is aligned with Russia, so a war between Germany and Russia is also a war between France and Germany. This is one of the reasons why the First World War becomes such a massive event so quickly. Because once you had a declaration of war in this region of the world, the so-called dominoes of these alliances began to fall. Germany declares war on Russia, Russia declares war on Germany, France declares war on Germany, and so on and so forth. And Great Britain comes in, the United Kingdom comes in a little bit after that, and we'll talk about that, why. Now, in a little bit, we'll talk about why. Now, if you look at this right here, this is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today, of course, Austria, Hungary are very small countries. In 1914, they were a very large Central European power, and they had been influencing the geopolitical realities of Central Europe for over a century at this time. But Austria-Hungary, within its imperial territory, had a myriad of different national competing identities. And so you see these arrows, all these arrows refer to different nationalist groups at the time. The Slovaks, the Czechs, the Italians, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbians. All of these groups are groups that see a national identity as separate from that of Austria-Hungary and tends to see Austria-Hungary as repressing their identity. And so you have this large empire controlling these people, and you have nationalist movements, particularly that of the Serbians, that are struggling and vying for independence from this large European empire. The catalyst for the war, of course, the initial catalyst for the war, of course, is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, which is depicted here in an artistic depiction of this assassination in 1914. June 28th, 1914. The assassination was in the city of Sarajevo, which in the 21st century is part of the country of Bosnia. At this time, Sarajevo was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there was a group known as the Black Hand, and they recruited a young, impressionable individual named Gavrilo Princip, who is pictured here, to assassinate the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And in a myriad of events, there was a failed attempt at killing Franz Ferdinand, and ultimately his motorcade is going through Sarajevo despite warnings to the contrary that they should even be there at all. And his driver made a wrong turn, had to stop the car, allowing Gavrilo Princip to assassinate Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo.